I spent 3 years building something in the dark, and I mean that almost literally. My home office was a converted second bedroom with blackout curtains I'd never bothered to open. I worked after my daughter went to sleep, usually around 9, and I'd go until 1 or 2 in the morning. My husband stopped asking what I was working on after the first year. Not because he didn't care, because every time he asked, I talked for 45 minutes and he'd fall asleep on the couch. He's an electrician. Code bores him in the kindest possible way. What I was building was called Lumen, not the company, not yet, just the model. A machine learning system I'd designed to analyze unstructured legal documents, the kind of dense, inconsistent, nightmare paperwork that smaller law firms and HR departments drown in every quarter. Things like employment contracts with conflicting clauses buried on page 19. Benefits disputes where the original policy documents contradicted the addendum from 3 years later. Workers' comp filings where the language was technically compliant but practically incomprehensible. I'd spent 9 years as a paralegal before moving into legal tech. I knew exactly where the pain lived. I knew it the way you know a bad knee, intimately, specifically at 3 in the morning. Lumen wasn't magic. It was just very, very good at a very specific thing. And I'd built it entirely on my own time, on my own equipment, using open source libraries and my own annotated datasets that I'd been compiling since 2019. I have receipts for the cloud storage. I have the commit history. I have emails to myself with notes dated at midnight on the Tuesday, because that's how this works when you're building something real and nobody's paying you to do it yet. I want you to hold on to that, my own time, my own equipment, my own data, because that's the part that matters. I joined Hartwell Legal Solutions in the spring. Mid-size company, maybe 200 employees based in the Chicago suburbs. They did software and compliance consulting for HR departments across the Midwest. Good benefits, reasonable salary, and they had a product roadmap that seemed genuinely interesting to me at the time. My title was Senior Solutions Architect, which is a fancy way of saying I was supposed to take client problems and translate them into things the engineering team could build. I was good at it. Within 4 months, I'd redesigned 3 client onboarding workflows and reduced one client's document processing time by something like 60%. I liked the work. I liked most of the people. My direct manager, I'll call him my manager, was the kind of guy who said, let's circle back, and meant it as a threat. Polished, political, the type who scheduled one-on-ones but spent the first 10 minutes talking about his weekend. I didn't dislike him. I just learned quickly to protect my energy around him. The CEO, I'll call her the founder, was different. Brilliant, actually. She'd built Hartwell from a 2-person consulting shop and had real vision. I respected her. That made what came later harder to process. About 8 months in, I made a mistake. Not a legal mistake. Not an ethical mistake. Just a human one, the kind that comes from excitement and trust and not reading the fine print carefully enough. We were in a product strategy meeting and I mentioned Lumen, offhandedly, the way you mention something when the conversation lines up almost perfectly with what you've been obsessing over for years. Someone said the company was looking at expanding into document intelligence, and I heard myself say, actually, I've been developing something in that space. The room got quiet in a specific way. The founder looked at me. Tell me more. So I did. I told them about the model architecture, the training data, the error rate that gotten it down to over 18 months of iteration. I told them about the use cases I'd already mapped out, which were almost exactly what Hartwell was now describing as a future product direction. I should have stopped talking about 40 minutes earlier than I did. The following week, my manager asked me to put together a technical brief. Just an overview, he said, so the product team could understand the scope. I wrote it. 12 pages. I even included some of the benchmark results. Then I got called into a meeting with my manager and someone from HR. I remember the HR rep had a legal pad and a pen she kept clicking. She slid a 1-page document across the table. We just need you to sign this, she said. It's standard. Just clarifies IP ownership for anything created during your employment. I read it. It wasn't standard. It had a clause, buried in paragraph 4, dressed up in language about related fields of work and materials developed using professional knowledge, that was broad enough to swallow Lumen whole. Basically, anything I'd created that was relevant to Hartwell's business, regardless of when or where I'd created it, could be claimed as company intellectual property. I said I wasn't comfortable signing without talking to an attorney. My manager smiled. Of course. Take the weekend. I took the weekend. I talked to an attorney. She confirmed what I'd suspected. The clause was aggressive and, depending on how a court read it, potentially enforceable in Illinois. She also pointed out something I hadn't thought about. I had brought Lumen up myself in a company meeting and described it in significant detail. That was going to matter. I didn't sign the document. I went back on Monday and said I was happy to discuss a separate licensing or partnership arrangement, but that I wouldn't sign over IP rights to work I'd done independently, on my own time, before many of these people had even heard my name. My manager said he'd take it up with leadership. 3 days later, he came back and told me the company was moving forward with internal development on the Document Intelligence Initiative, and that my role would be restructured to focus on client-facing work only. I would no longer be involved in product development. I understood exactly what that meant. They were going to build it anyway. They'd seen enough of Lumen in that brief, in my 12 pages of documented architecture, to start reconstructing it. They had a full engineering team. They had funding. And they had my own words, in my own document, explaining exactly how the hardest parts worked. I went home that night and I did not cry. I've thought about why since then. I think it's because some part of me had already known. The moment that HR rep clicked her pen, something in my chest had already gone cold and calculating. I started planning. Here's what they didn't know about Lumen. They'd seen the benchmark results. They'd read the architecture brief. What I had not told them, what was not in any document I'd ever given them, was the licensing layer. Lumen wasn't just a model. It was a model with the validation system baked into its lowest level inference calls, something I'd built in originally as a piracy protection mechanism back when I was first thinking about commercializing it independently. The system worked like this. Every time Lumen was instantiated, it made a silent, encrypted handshake with a verification server that I controlled. If the handshake failed, if the license key was absent, expired, or unrecognized, the model didn't crash. It didn't throw an error. It ran. It just ran wrong, in a way that was almost impossible to detect in normal testing, but would produce subtly, systematically incorrect outputs under specific conditions. I called it the dim switch. Not a kill switch exactly, more like turning the lights down until you can't see what you're looking at. They could reverse engineer my architecture from the brief. They could rebuild the training pipeline. They could approximate everything I described. But they couldn't replicate the validation layer because I'd never told them it existed. The question was whether they'd be smart enough to build their version from scratch without ever touching my actual code. They were not. The first sign came about 4 months later through a former colleague who was still at the company. She texted me one evening, we'd stayed friendly, and said the engineering team had been pulling long hours on something called Project Meridian. She didn't know the details, but she said they were demoing it for investors the following month. I filed that away. The second sign came from LinkedIn. One of Hartwell's engineers posted something vague about exciting progress on a proprietary NLP pipeline for legal document analysis. The language was imprecise enough that it could have been coincidence. It wasn't. The third sign was a recruiter reaching out to me on Hartwell's behalf, which was so audacious I actually laughed out loud at my kitchen table. They were looking to hire someone with experience in document intelligence systems with a focus on employment law applications. That is not a general job description. That is a description of Lumen. I forwarded it to my attorney. She told me we were building a case but weren't ready to move yet. Discovery would take time. We needed to see what they actually released. I agreed. I could wait. The investor demo was a Thursday in November. I knew the date because my former colleague texted me that morning. They're presenting today. Big room. The founder is there. Whole leadership team. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and I thought about the validation server, which was sitting on a cloud instance I paid for out of pocket, which I had not decommissioned which was still running. Hartwell had never gotten a license key from me, which meant any version of Lumen they'd incorporated into Project Meridian was running in an unlicensed state, which meant the dim switch was active, which meant that for the last 4 months, every time their engineers had tested this system, it had been producing outputs that were just slightly, systematically off, not enough to catch in basic QA, not enough to trigger obvious alarms, but enough to matter enormously when you put the system in front of sophisticated investors who knew what accurate legal analysis was supposed to look like. I hadn't done anything to them. I'd simply never given them the key. My attorney later told me that distinction was legally significant. I hadn't sabotaged their system. I hadn't introduced anything into their environment. I had declined to license my own property to people who had taken it without permission. What happened as a result was entirely a consequence of their own choices. I've thought about the ethics of this a lot. Genuinely, I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing sitting at that table. I felt something. I felt it quite specifically. But I also believe that when someone takes something you built with years of your own time and tries to dress it up as their own work in front of a room full of investors, the universe is allowed to have opinions about that. The demo, from what I pieced together afterward, did not go well. The system produced analysis on a set of sample employment contracts. The outputs looked plausible. But 2 of the investors in the room had backgrounds in employment law. They caught errors that a working system wouldn't have made, misclassifications that were subtle but consistent with exactly the type of systematic drift the dim switch produced. One of them apparently asked, point blank, whether the system had been validated on real case outcomes. It had not been, because it couldn't have been, because it wasn't working correctly. The meeting ended. The funding conversation stalled. My former colleague texted me that evening. Something went wrong. They're not talking about it, but the vibe is bad. I typed back, I'm sorry to hear that, which was more honest than it might sound. I was sorry. I was sorry it had come to that at all. What followed was messy in the way that these things always are. Hartwell's engineering lead apparently spent 2 weeks trying to figure out what had gone wrong. He ran the system against every benchmark they had. On most of them, it performed fine. The problem only surfaced with specific document types under specific conditions, the exact conditions that would show up in a sophisticated investor demo and not in a standard internal QA pass. My attorney got a call from Hartwell's legal team. They were fishing. They wanted to know if I had any ongoing involvement with software systems related to document analysis. My attorney told them I had no obligation to answer that and would not be doing so. 6 weeks later, Hartwell announced they were pausing the Meridian initiative to refocus on core product lines. 3 months after that, I received a settlement offer. I won't go into the numbers, but I will say that my attorney called it better than expected and that I will not need to worry about my daughter's college tuition. I signed a confidentiality agreement, which is why I'm not using real names here, and why certain details have been adjusted. What I can tell you is that the core of what I've described is true. I want to say something practical here, because if you've ever been in any version of this situation, you deserve more than just a satisfying story. Before you share anything, a prototype, a concept, an internal brief, anything you've built on your own, get it in writing that your employer has no claim to work done outside of company time on personal equipment. Many states have statutes that protect independent work, but the specific language of your employment contract can override those protections if you're not careful. California has some of the strongest employee protections on this. Illinois, where I was, is more complicated. Know your state. Know your contract. Read paragraph 4. If you're in a meeting and you hear the phrase, let's document this for the team, slow down. That instinct you feel, the one telling you to share what you've built because it's exciting and it fits and the room is paying attention, that instinct is not wrong. But it needs a lawyer looking over its shoulder. And if someone tells you a document is standard and slides it across a table while someone else in the room is clicking a pen, just take your time. Standard is a word people use when they don't want you to read carefully. I run my own company now. It's small, 4 people including me, and we license Lumen to mid-size law firms and HR departments who pay us for access and support and customization. It turns out there's a real market for a system that actually works. My husband finally understands what I was doing in that second bedroom all those years. It took me showing him the first wire transfer from a client and watching his face do the math. "You built this," he said. "Yeah," I said, "at 1 in the morning. A lot of 1 in the mornings." He was quiet for a second. Then I should have stayed awake. I told him it was okay. I had the blackout curtains. I was fine in the dark. Here's the thing about building something in secret. In your own time, on your own terms, you learn to trust it completely. You don't have anyone else's fingerprints on it. You don't have to wonder what you owe someone or what they contributed or whether they have a claim. It's yours in a way that very few things in your professional life ever will be. When someone tries to take that from you, they're not just taking the work. They're reaching for the part of you that stayed up until 2 in the morning when no one was watching and built something real anyway. You can take a lot of things from a person. You cannot take the mind that made it. If you're sitting in your own dark room right now, working on your own thing, trusting your own instincts while the rest of the house sleeps, keep going, document everything, date your commits, keep your receipts, and think very carefully about who you tell. I've thought a lot about what actually caused all of this. Not the legal part. I understand the legal part now. I mean the deeper mechanism. Why did it unfold the way it did? The honest answer is that every person in that chain made a choice, and the choices compounded. I made a choice to speak up in that meeting. I was excited, and the room was listening, and I trusted that enthusiasm more than I trusted my instincts. That choice cost me months and money and a lot of sleep I didn't have to spare. I own that. I'm not going to pretend I was entirely blameless in how it started, because the truth is that wisdom I didn't have yet would have told me to keep my mouth shut until I had a contract. My manager made a choice to take what I described and treat it as an opportunity rather than a boundary. He had options. He could have brought a licensing conversation to the table the right way. He didn't, because it was easier to slide a document across a table and call it standard. HR made a choice to use language that was designed to obscure rather than clarify. That's not a mistake. That's a strategy. And strategies have consequences. The engineering team made a choice to build on a foundation they hadn't fully examined because the timeline was aggressive and nobody wanted to ask the hard question, where exactly did this architecture come from? None of these choices were made in a vacuum. They built on each other the way pressure builds, slowly, invisibly, until something gives. What I keep coming back to is this. The dim switch didn't do anything to them. It just sat there, doing exactly what it was always designed to do. Protect something I'd built. The damage came entirely from their own decision to use something they hadn't earned the right to use. I didn't reach into their system. I simply never handed them the key, and they never thought to ask whether one existed. That's the part I want you to sit with. If you're someone who builds things, integrity isn't just a moral concept, it's structural. When you build something with integrity, with care, with documentation, with honest intent, that integrity is actually in the work. It's load-bearing. And when someone tries to use your work without the foundation you built it on, the cracks show up eventually. Maybe not in QA, maybe not in internal testing, but in a room full of people who know what good work looks like when the pressure is real. My daughter is 9. She's already got a notebook full of ideas she carries around everywhere. Inventions mostly, and what she calls solutions to problems. I don't tell her to protect her ideas, not yet. What I tell her is to understand her ideas completely before she shares them, to know all the way down what makes them work. Because the mind that made something is the one thing that cannot be copied. That's not a platitude, I lived it. The people who took Lumen had my architecture and my benchmarks and my 12 pages of documentation. What they didn't have was the decade of experience that told me exactly which failure mode to protect against, and the foresight to build that protection in from the start, quietly, without telling anyone, because some things you build for yourself before you build them for the world. The dim switch existed because I'd thought about what could go wrong before anyone else thought to ask. That's what I want you to take from this. Not the revenge part, though I understand why that's satisfying. The preparation part. The part where I sat alone at 1 in the morning and asked myself, what happens if someone tries to take this? And then I built the answer into the work itself. Resilience isn't just getting back up, it's designing your life so that certain falls can't finish you.